decision does restrict the DPRK's access to U.S. foreign assistance. It's unclear whether that's going to include humanitarian assistance, and it also bans American assistance to countries that trade with Pyongyang.
The practical effects may be limited, but hopefully we're closing off a few loopholes with this. It's really just the latest step in a series of, as you can see, ongoing steps to increase the pressure. I call it the peaceful pressure campaign. The president calls it the maximum pressure campaign.
Now, of course, the DPRK taken off this state sponsor of terror list back in 2008 by President George W. Bush, who was doing so in an effort to bring Pyongyang to the negotiating table to end its nuclear ambitions. Here is President Trump on Monday reversing that decision.
This designation will impose further sanctions and penalties on North Korea and related persons and supports our maximum pressure campaign to isolate the murderers. One of the primary goals of our trip was to pursue the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I want to begin this morning by meeting and by talking about the fact that we will be instituting a very critical step, and that'll start right now. Today, the United States is designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. Should have happened a long time ago, should have happened years ago. In addition to threatening the world by nuclear devastation, North Korea has repeatedly supported acts of international terrorism, including assassinations on foreign soil. As we take this action today, our thoughts turn to Otto Warmbier, wonderful young man, and the countless others so brutally affected by the North Korean oppression. This designation will impose further sanctions and penalties on North Korea and related persons and supports our maximum pressure campaign to isolate the murderous regime that you've all been reading about and in some cases writing about. Tomorrow, the Treasury Department will be announcing an additional sanction and a very large one on North Korea, and this will be going on over the next 2 weeks. It'll be the highest level of sanctions by the time it's finished over a 2-week period. The North Korean regime must be lawful. It must end its unlawful nuclear and ballistic missile development and cease all support for international terrorism, which it is not doing.
South Korea woke up to the news on Tuesday morning that the US had relisted North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. Seoul's foreign ministry issued a statement backing the move.
The government views this action as part of the international community's efforts to denuclearize North Korea through strong pressure and sanctions, and believes it will help in resolving North Korean nuclear issue peacefully.
Seoul added that they continue to work closely with the US on all matters related to trying to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table, and that relisting the regime as a sponsor of terrorism does not change that. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson also agreed that assassinations ordered by Pyongyang on foreign soil, such as the murder of Kim Jong-un's half-brother Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia earlier this year, constituted a terror attack.
Our government views Kim Jong-nam's assassination as a clear act of terrorism.
Other international partners have expressed their support for the White House's decision. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that he welcomes the relisting, saying it raises the pressure on North Korea. And Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said it mirrors the determination of the international community to bring North Korea, quote, back to its senses.
Kim Jong-un runs a global criminal operation from North Korea, peddling arms, peddling drugs, engaged in cybercrime, and of course threatening the stability of the region with his nuclear weapons.
The latest round of sanctions falls under 3 categories. 4 Chinese companies who allegedly exported raw materials and computers to Pyongyang, and 1 Chinese individual, Mr. Sidong-sun, who reportedly owns one of the designated companies. DPRK entities include 9 companies and 20 ships. According to photographs released by Washington, these companies allegedly used ship-to-ship transfers to move products in an effort to evade sanctions, and that is also a violation of September's UN Security Council resolution, which passed unanimously. One DPRK company also named on allegations it exported DPRK workers to generate revenue for Pyongyang, and this too violates that same UN resolution. Now, none of these sanctions are connected to Monday's White House announcement that Washington is adding Pyongyang back to its state sponsor of terrorism list. That decision is raising some concerns in Beijing, though, where there's fear that any further pressure on Pyongyang could lead to the resumption of its unlawful missile tests. China Daily's English paper issuing this editorial on Tuesday, quote, "The U.S. designation of the DPRK as a state sponsor of terrorism could lay waste to the efforts of China and Russia to bring the DPRK back to the negotiating table."
We still hope that all parties concerned will put forth more efforts, which will be conducive to alleviating tensions and bringing relevant parties back to the negotiating table, back to the right track of dialogue and negotiation.
And at the same time, airline Air China is reportedly suspending flights between Beijing and the DPRK. An airline press officer was quoted by the Associated Press saying the flights were, quote, temporarily suspended due to unsatisfactory business operations. There is no mention of the change on the airline's English website. And Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is now set to meet with Seoul's top diplomat. According to the Blue House, ROK Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa will discuss ways Seoul and Beijing can work together to reach a peaceful resolution of the DPRK nuclear issue. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson only mentioned that improving bilateral ties is on the agenda.
And Trump, I mean, it was a long overdue step. They should never have been taken off that list in 2008 by my old boss, President Bush. Man got sold a bill of goods by the State Department, telling him if only he'd take them off the terrorism list, they'd give up their nukes. Well, here we are 10 years later.
Has the State Department ever been right about anything over the course of, say, the last 25 years?
I can tell you for sure, 100% on North Korea. For 25 years, they have been dead wrong. They were this time. A lot of good people argued against it. I'm happy to say, including my boss and people like John Bolton, Vice President Cheney. But here we are, and thank God President Trump has taken this step, because these guys have always fit to the T the label of a terrorist state.
Well, I don't know where we are. I don't know if the Chinese envoy that President Xi Jinping sent, along with a delegation to North Korea, if they've produced anything. Do you have a sense of success or a draw or a failure?
No, I mean, the fact is we just don't know what the results of those are. Hopefully the Chinese will report those out to the United States, but the president has promised that come tomorrow there are some new important sanctions coming down.
Yeah, but you and I know that sanctions haven't worked over the course of that quarter century. They just haven't worked. And the reason they haven't worked, as you and I both know as well, is that the Chinese supports North Korea.
Exactly.
Provide their missile technology, provide their nuclear technology.
Exactly, and their banks and companies finance all of the transactions in that country, almost 90% of their business. Question is whether the president is willing to take on those major, well-connected politically Chinese banks and
South
conglomerates.
Korea says that they will have, the North Koreans will have the ability to deliver an ICBM with a nuclear warhead to the United States within the next 30 days. Your thoughts? As we wrap up, we got about 30 seconds.
I don't know if it's 30 days or 3 months, Lou,
well, they
but
said
it's coming.
30 days.
Well, it is coming. They have been good to their word. They're going to test these things. They're going to test their nukes, and they want to be able to hold American cities hostage. That's their aim, and they're getting very, very close to being there.
Isn't North Korea already on the short list of state sponsors of terrorism? And the answer is yes, they were, as you pointed out. And then about 9-10 years ago, the Bush administration removed them for that very reason, in an effort to try to denuclearize the peninsula. And just like every other effort that we've had over the years, they were all ineffective. I mean, we are at this point because all those other previous actions were ineffective, and the North Koreans continued this march to perfect their weapons and ballistic missile capability.
Yeah, and as far as them being on the list or off the list, what is significant about that is it dictates what type of sanctions they're getting at the time, right? I mean, and this is the last few little shreds that we have left to sort of put a nail in the coffin.
That's exactly right. Look, I mean, some people will argue that, you know, given how we've ratcheted up the sanctions effort recently, some people will argue, well, look, this just inflames the situation without, you know, realistically adding additional sanctions because we've already layered on so much. Well, frankly, that's a strange logic train. There is no reason not to clamp down as severely as possible in terms of adding as many sanctions as we can, and that's what this does. It just layers on some more ability to do this, particularly financial transactions, and so there's no reason not to do it. The idea that somehow the Trump administration just threw this idea out there. Look, they've been on this trip through Asia, and I can guarantee you that members of the administration have been populating this idea of the state-sponsored terrorism label with the Chinese authorities, with Japanese authorities, with South Korean authorities as they're on this trip. They don't, you know, that's how this works. Yeah. And so anybody who's complaining about this, I think, frankly, they probably fall in the camp that says anything this administration does, no matter what it relates to, is wrong, and they're just hoping they'll fail.
I saw, you know, there was an interesting distinction during the press availability today where Rex Tillerson said, I call this Operation Peaceful Pressure, and President Trump calls it maximum pressure. But make no mistake, we're talking about the same thing. I mean, it's kind of funny that they would label it and see it so differently. What's your take?
Yeah. Well, I call it extreme pressure. Yeah. So I've got even a different name for it. You know, it doesn't matter what the labeling is. What really matters is whether we are able to actually enact the sanctions, right? Past sanctions. The problem we've had, the reason why we're at this point with North Korea and their development of the weapons and missiles is because previous sanctions efforts were half-hearted. And in particular, the Russians, the Chinese, and others were able to circumvent them. Yeah. So what we've done, I think, recently, the reason I think there's some hope here is because we have seen some change in the Chinese mindset. There appears to be an understanding with the Chinese, to some degree the Russians, that now is the time. They actually have to come through and follow through with these sanctions. If they do that, this could have the desired impact.
To take them off the list in 2008, it perverted the reason the list exists to begin with. If a country meets the criteria to be a state sponsor of terrorism, it should be on the list. Condi Rice wanted to take them off the list because she believed it would help facilitate negotiating a deal with North Korea on its nuclear weapons program. That turned out to be completely wrong, but in any event, it politicized the list in a very unhelpful way. So I think this is remedying a past mistake. It's not going to have any effect on North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons now that they're this many years closer to achieving that objective. I don't think it will stop them, but it will demonstrate to the world this is the nature of the regime we're dealing with.
All right,
this is
so
their
what happens,
character.
practically speaking, with this designation? Because they're already under some pretty extreme sanctions, and China is going along with them, particularly the banking sanctions lately. So what more does this designation do to North Korea?
Well, it does open other sanctions possibilities. It's not entirely clear that China itself really is fully complying. But my view has been when you have a state sponsor of terrorists like this and have others that aid it, like Iran, for example, which is also a state sponsor of terrorism, that you can make a pretty good argument that those who aid and abet what a state sponsor of terrorism does themselves could face designation. So I think if you're going to use this statutory authority forcefully, it could have a lot of implications beyond just North Korea.
All right, I want to pick up on that in just a little bit, but I want to talk about China, because clearly, while the president was visiting China and the region, it would have been embarrassing for both countries if North Korea had undergone more missile tests. They didn't do that. And to me, that shows that China is able to exert pressure and influence on them when they choose. How did you read it?
It's possible. It's also possible there were just reasons the North Koreans weren't prepared to do anything. Sometimes it might have to do with the scientific or engineering or technical aspects of their testing program. There have been reports, for example, that their last 6 nuclear tests, quite likely thermonuclear, may have damaged their underground testing facility in a way that precluded another test until steps are taken. We just don't know. I think it's very hard, given our limited knowledge of North Korea, to really understand a lot of why they do what they do.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's just another reason to make sure they don't get deliverable nuclear weapons.
All right, and speaking of that list of state sponsors of terror, who else should be on the list other than Sudan and Iran and Syria?
Well, I would not take Sudan off the list, that's for sure, and I would look at adding any other states that, as I say, work with Iran, work with North Korea, because I believe the nuclear programs themselves are programs of terrorism. Iran and North Korea, both of them, will not pose a military threat to the United States. The intention of having these nuclear weapons, if they were to be used against us, would be to kill our civilians.
Yeah.
Or if North Korea attacked Japan or attacked South Korea. So I think the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction in itself gives evidence that a state should be on this list.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, again, have a great birthday. Whatever you do to party, I'm sure it's borderline illegal, and I hope you do.